Hey everybody, I'm Adam, and this is Think Club. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is a Canadian clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. Dr. Peterson rose to prominence in 2016 after he challenged new proposed Canadian legislation which would make it illegal to misgender transgender people. This added fuel to a growing political debate over the relationship between biological sex and gender.
I didn't say that transsexual people didn't exist. I said that gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex do not vary independently, which they don't.
Nicholas, this is where I want to bring you into the discussion because you teach this. You teach trans studies. So if you would, give us a brief primer on so many gender identities that, in your view, require non-traditional pronouns.
It's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex.
To many people, it seems quite shocking that people today believe that there is no such thing as biological sex. When over a decade earlier, in 2005, medical doctor, psychologist, and best-selling author Dr. Leonard Sax was chronicling the growing scientific advancements in our understanding of biological sex differences in his popular book, Why Gender Matters.
If you give a little girl a truck or a little boy a doll, you might find the girls tucked the truck in for a nap and the doll's been turned into a toy soldier. Well, according to Dr. Leonard Sax, that's really no surprise, as he explains in his new book, Why Gender Matters, what parents and teachers need to know about the emerging science of sex differences. Dr. Sax, good to meet you.
Good morning, Al.
10 years later, when Dr. Peterson was gaining popularity, uncontroversial statements from 2005 seemed not only forgotten, but actively rebuked. As an avid follower of this debate, I began pairing some of Dr. Peterson's interviews with audiobook excerpts from Dr. Sax's book, Why Gender Matters.
And just to be clear, that you think that's predominantly a female modus operandi?
It isn't that I think that.
Well,
It's that the clinical literature indicates that.
Psychologist Janet Lever spent a whole year at elementary school playgrounds watching girls and boys play. Boys fight a lot, she noticed, about 20 times as often as girls do. To her surprise, though, she found that boys who fight each other usually end up being better friends after the fight.
These videos turned out to be very popular, as it appeared Dr. Peterson and Dr. Sax were on very similar missions.
That was a big motivation for me to write Why Gender Matters 14 years ago and the revised edition last year, because so much has changed. 20 years ago, if a girl wanted to roll in the mud and wrestle a hog, that was fine. Now, the parents are asked, maybe your daughter is trans. Have you thought about transitioning her to the male role? This is psychotic, and I mean that quite literally. It is deranged. It is detached from reality. Asking 7-year-olds who they want to be intimate with sexually is not appropriate. It's not meaningful. That 5-year-old has no way of knowing whether he's going to grow to be a gay man, a straight man, what have you. It is malpractice.
Yeah.
To put that boy in a dress, change his name to Emily, and then prepare to cut off his balls.
So feeling very familiar with both Dr. Sax and Dr. Peterson's work, I reached out to Dr. Sax for an interview. And that's when I discovered.
Well, you had mentioned in your email that you were pairing me with Jordan Peterson, and I dismissively said I'm not a fan of Jordan Peterson.
So what follows is a sometimes contentious interview with an author and scientist I greatly respect about another scientist and author that I greatly respect. While I do my best to defend Jordan Peterson and articulate Jordan Peterson's message, I am not Jordan Peterson.
Courage means that you know your shortcomings and your limitations and your inadequacies. You find the strength to push forward anyhow. I do regard humility as a virtue, which Jordan Peterson certainly does not.
You're so wrong. You are so wrong about this. Like, courage and humility are a fundamental part of his message. He talks about courage all the time. If Jordan Peterson happens to see this interview, perhaps Dr. Peterson could debate Dr. Sax on what I see as a difference of opinion over an effective strategy to combat a growing gender ideology, based more on wishful thinking than sound empirical study. Dr. Sax is both a medical doctor and a Ph.D. research psychologist, as well as the author of 4 books: Why Gender Matters, Girls on the Edge, Boys Adrift, and the New York Times bestseller, The Collapse of Parenting. Dr. Sax has been featured in media both nationally and internationally and has spoken on issues of child and adolescent development all over the world. Well, Dr. Sax has a rather critical critique of Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. I think you'll find much of our conversation on transgenderism, boys' education, gender politics, and academia very much in sync with the work and message of Jordan Peterson. So with that out of the way, here's my interview with best-selling author, Dr. Leonard Sax.
Well, you had mentioned in your email that you were pairing me with Jordan Peterson, and I dismissively said I'm not a fan of Jordan Peterson, and I didn't expect to hear from you again, but then you asked why I'm not a fan of Jordan Peterson, and I explained, look, I'm not a follower of his. I know he's got fans who seem to be fans because of his great ability to respond to hostile interviewers in a clever way. But all I know about him is what I read in his book, 12 Rules for Life. And I came to the book with high expectations because I subscribe both to the Wall Street Journal and to the New York Times. I read both Peggy Noonan and David Brooks. And both Peggy Noonan and David Brooks gave him glowing reviews, spoke of him as in almost messiah-esque terms, that he is the intellectual for our time. So I came to the book with high expectations, and I was profoundly disappointed. So where to begin? I'll give you one example. Okay, in his book, 12 Rules for Life, he divides the book in a very binary fashion, and he embraces this binary, that there's order, there's chaos, there's male, there's female. Okay, he's not the first person to do that. I think you could say that one of the first people to do that in the Western tradition was Aristotle, who wrote a book called Metaphysics over 2,000 years ago. In the Metaphysics, Aristotle says there's order and there's chaos. The universe is binary. There's order and there's chaos, there's light and dark, good and evil, straight and curved, dry and wet, male and female. And Aristotle explicitly equates male with order, light, good, and dry, and equates female with chaos, dark, curved, and wet, and evil. Well, that's one criticism. Well, digging a little deeper, what evidence, what does Dr. Peterson have in mind when he says order? Well, he says examples of order are the classroom, the supermarket checkout line. Well, I've visited over 400 schools over the last 17 years. I've been in a great many classrooms, and I can tell you when it comes to order and chaos in the classroom, girls are order and boys are chaos to the extent that there is a binary. I have been in the principal's office with 9 kids who were sent down for discipline referrals, and they're all boys. When people challenge Dr. Peterson on these or other points, he says, well, you're taking me too literally. But words have meaning. And if you're going to say there's order and chaos, and order is male and chaos is female, either that means something or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, why are you bothering to say it? And digging more deeply. Okay, so there's male and female. So he has the temerity to speak of religion. And he uses religion in a very bizarre way. Jordan Peterson's religion is to actual religion as masturbation is to actual sex, okay? And I'm not joking. I think the analogy is pretty accurate. So religion, and here I'm talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because that's the religion that Peterson clearly has in mind. He's citing the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. The religion of Judaism and Christianity and Islam is all about submission to the will of God. The word Islam means submission. Jesus in the Lord's Prayer says, "Thy will be done." And Judaism is all about love the Lord your God. So that's, if you engage that tradition, it's about trying to discern God's will. Now, atheists, that's fine. But don't pretend to be both. Don't pick and choose, as Peterson does. So, chapter 1 of his book, 12 Rules, he says, the dominance hierarchy is older than trees. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. And in support of that, he cites Jesus Christ, who he appears never to have read anything that Jesus's followers wrote about him. Like, if someone smacks you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Jesus reportedly said to his followers, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man, a man high in the dominance hierarchy, to get into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus knew all about the dominance hierarchy, and he thought it was evil. And he challenged people to do the opposite. Not to try to assert your place in the dominance hierarchy, but to serve. One of the last things we're told Jesus did before he died, before he was executed, was to get down on his knees and wash the feet of his disciples. And Jesus is constantly saying things like, the servant is greater than the master. And Paul, his chief exponent, says that the least of you is greater than the greatest. That serving is better than being master. So the actual religion that we find in the New Testament is pretty much the opposite of what Jordan Peterson is pushing. But again, as I said, the relationship between Jordan Peterson's religion and actual religion is very strictly analogous to the relationship between masturbation and actual intercourse. When I'm being intimate with my wife, it's an intercourse. We are interacting with one another. I'm not using her as a tool of masturbation. We are interacting with one another. I'm trying to please her. She's trying to please me. When a man is masturbating, he doesn't care. It's just whatever he wants. And that's Jordan Peterson's religion. It has no substantive connection to Judaism or Christianity. It's just something he invents to give him good feelings. And it is not only disconnected from the actual religious tradition, it is contradicted by the actual religious tradition. As I said, Jesus is not about the dominance hierarchy. Jesus regards the dominance hierarchy as evil and as what we're trying to resist. And Jordan Peterson hasn't even gotten that most simple kindergarten Sunday school message about the message of Jesus Christ.
Well, you put me in a strange position here because I had intended to talk to you mostly as a psychologist. You are both a medical doctor and a psychologist. I don't know if you're actually a clinical psychologist or not.
No.
Okay.
I earned my doctorate in experimental psychology, but I am a practicing family doctor and have been a medical doctor now for, it'll be 33 years in May.
So much of your work seems to overlap with the ideas that Jordan Peterson is putting out into the world. And it really seems, we had talked a little bit before we started recording about how I'm an atheist. So you've got me at a disadvantage if you're disagreeing with Jordan Peterson on theological grounds, because I don't know that I'm necessarily qualified to weigh in.
It's not really theological grounds. It's just on the grounds of be one thing or another. If you want to be an atheist, that's fine, but then don't cite the Bible as a source of authority. It's just weird.
Well, this is interesting because I feel like Jordan Peterson is explaining the Bible in kind of a scientific materialist framework through relating it to psychology and in particular evolutionary psychology, that someone like me who is not necessarily a believer in a God or a believer in the Jesus Christ story can still respect the ethic that we've kind of inherited through this type of inherited wisdom. So I think that's really the power of Jordan Peterson. And when you're when you're
I don't agree.
Yeah. So, but you seem strongly in disagreement with him over the male-female issue, which is a typical place where people push back. But it is where you have the most overlap with him, as far as the sex and gender debate going on in society today. So,
yeah. But here again, he shows how shallow and uninformed he is, because he reduces male and female to a binary. Black and white. And as someone who's been a medical doctor for 33 years and who spent 20 of those years really grappling in a serious way with male and female, gender is complicated in ways that Jordan Peterson, despite being a clinical psychologist, seems to have no awareness. So let me just give you one quick concrete example of what I mean when I say gender is complicated. Let's think of two boys. One is Brett and one is Jason. Brett loves football. Brett is all boy. Jason over here doesn't like football, doesn't like to hit, doesn't like to be hit, doesn't like violent video games, would much rather draw a picture of a flower. Brett, the boy who's all boy, turns out to be gay. Jason, the boy who doesn't like to play football and would rather draw a picture of a flower, turns out to be straight. There's a lot of things going on in gender. There's sexual orientation, there's what you like to do in your free time, there's how you perceive the world, and it's complicated, but it matters. So in North America, United States and Canada today, unfortunately, this whole issue has become politicized. And on the one hand, we have people who are left of center, who tend to be Democrats, who say gender doesn't matter, it's a social construct, we don't need to pay any attention to it. On the other hand, we have people right of center who say gender is hardwired and boys are blue and girls are pink. And I'm kind of in the middle. Back in 2005, Time magazine had a cover story on gender, and they interviewed me and they quoted me, and the reporter said, Dr. Sax is one of the few in the middle who understands that there are hardwired differences, but who's trying to prevent the differences from becoming limitations. And I think that's a fair characterization of what I'm about. A lot of what is gender is hardwired, not just differences between male and female, but variations among males and among females. So I just mentioned two boys. One plays football and the other would rather draw a picture of a flower. That difference, we now know, among those boys is largely hardwired and can be traced to innate differences in the androgen receptor in those two boys. That's very new research. That's all been published really in the last 10 years, and I find it immensely exciting. I write about it in my book, Why Gender Matters, devote a chapter to that, actually. This new understanding of variations among boys and why this boy likes football and this boy would rather draw a picture of a flower, and variations among girls. This girl is a girly girl, loves Barbie and makeup, and this girl would rather wrestle a hog and hates Barbies and would never use makeup. These differences are not random. They're not noise around a mean. They appear to be hardwired. They appear to be genetically programmed in many cases. So gender turns out to be fascinating and complicated. Jordan Peterson shows no awareness of any of this, and on the contrary, is constantly hammering on this binary. And for Jordan Peterson, the binaries align, meaning that straight, the male he has in mind is clearly a straight male who likes to play football. Maybe okay, strike that. So
yeah, I think you're taking it a bit far. I don't see Jordan Peterson being an ideologue like that. I think he's fighting against. I mean, where do you stand on the left taking gender? I mean, you've got people online that are saying sex isn't even a thing. Like that's crazy. So I see Jordan Peterson is fighting back really against this radical position on the left, but I don't see him taking the side of many conservatives where, wanting to take us back to traditional gender roles. I don't think Jordan Peterson is really in favor of that.
Well, where he troubles me, again, first and foremost, is this notion that you can align male with order and chaos with female. First of all, I think that's just empirically false. To the extent that we're going to try to align order and chaos with male and female, I would certainly align order with female and chaos with male, which is incidentally a long tradition in German writing going back 300 years. In English, the words culture and civilization are almost synonyms. In German writing, they are traditionally opposites. There's Kultur and there's Zivilisation. And Kultur is impulsive and passionate and romantic and breaking through and breaking down. The masculine is breaking the order, and the female is organizing and putting things in classification. So again, Jordan Peterson's alignment of order with male and chaos with female is not based in evidence. It's contradicted by evidence. And the examples he gives, like the classroom, contradict his own points. So he doesn't seem to have thought deeply about gender. He doesn't seem to have read much about gender. His remarks have there's these first the book came out of a bunch of posts for Quora. And the book reads very much like a stream of consciousness Quora post. It's not a scholarly work, and there's very little substance in it.
So you came out very hard against the recent APA guidelines. You wrote an excellent blog post on that, and you were going into how, they almost demonize masculinity. Your position when you came out in that blog post, and it's a great blog post, I encourage everyone to read it. I'll link it in the description below. Your position seems to be very much in line with Jordan Peterson's position on the. I see you shaking your head already.
Again, Jordan Peterson misses the point, just as the APA misses the point. Jordan Peterson, like the APA, says there's masculine and there's feminine. And the APA says we like feminine more than masculine. We want to get all the boys to be girls. That's simplistic, but that's essentially, I argue, what the APA is saying. Jordan Peterson essentially is saying, I like masculine better than feminine. I like order better than chaos. And I think men need to be more masculine. They're both missing the important point. And the important point that I try to make in my blog post is that when we talk about masculinity, we need to understand there are different kinds of masculinity. And here I cite Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman as someone who I think has written very insightfully on this from firsthand experience as an Army Ranger who's been deployed in combat. So Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman says, look, most humans, we don't want to be violent. We don't want to hit another human in the face. We don't want to be hit in the face. We don't seek out situations where we can hit people. And we don't seek out situations where we're going to be hit. We just prefer to live in our nice, civilized world where we don't expect to encounter violence. But Dave Grossman points out there are a minority of people, mostly men, who do enjoy violence, who like to hit. And I remember talking about this years ago at a workshop I was leading at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I happened to have talked to my host, whose name was Dave Rasmussen, who had played the line for Wisconsin football 20 years earlier. And I said to Mr. Rasmussen, I said, what do you think about that? I hadn't given him any warning I was going to call on him in front of a big workshop, an auditorium of people. And he said, without hesitation, he said, a good hit is better than sex. Some men enjoy hitting. Most men don't, but some men do. Some men enjoy violence. And Dave Grossman is speaking to those men. And he says, look, if you are one of those men who enjoys violence. You have to choose. Are you going to be a wolf or are you going to be a warrior? So the wolf is someone who goes into prey on the sheep, the people who don't like violence. The warrior is the man who defends the people from the wolf. So Dave Grossman says, you're not born being a wolf or a warrior. You have to choose. That's the key point, that both the APA, the American Psychological Association, and Jordan Peterson are completely missing. It's not about masculine versus feminine. It's about teaching boys to be good men, not to assert your place in the dominance hierarchy, as Jordan Peterson would have it.
See, I just honestly think that you are not familiar enough with Peterson's work, because Peterson does make the distinction, and so do researchers like Joseph Henrich. Like he makes a distinction between dominance and prestige. And a dominance hierarchy is very much predicated on bullies, like you're talking about. But when you're talking about a prestige hierarchy, you're talking about someone we look to because they are the righteous warrior, the noble warrior, the person that people want to follow. And I really think Peterson does make this distinction in his work. He doesn't want you to gain power through dominance, but he wants you to gain power through prestige, through competence. He constantly talks about the competence hierarchy. So, I mean, I obviously, if you aren't that familiar with his work, and if you're just digesting, what the New York Times is saying about him.
Well, I've read the book. I did read his book, 12 Rules for Life.
True. And your criticisms, I think, are completely valid, but I think you're getting, so little of his work is focused on this male chaos, female order thing. Well, now you got me saying it backwards too, because I tend to agree with you.
In his book, that he devotes the first chapter of his book,
and maybe
12 Rules for Life, to the dominance hierarchy, which he says is older than trees. And his first rule for life is this, something like stand up straight with your shoulders back and take your place in the dominance hierarchy.
He would give that same advice to women, though. As a psychologist, wouldn't you give that same advice to a female patient or a male patient to stand up straight, to be more confident, more assertive? Don't you think that's good for people?
I think it can be the road to endless frustration. Yes, absolutely. We live in a world that valorizes the rich and the famous. And that was not true of American civilization even 50 years ago or 30 years ago. And again, we can talk about the research that I cite in support of that. But very briefly, 50 years ago, American culture celebrated the Andy Griffith Show, I Love Lucy. In an episode of I Love Lucy, she has an opportunity to go to Hollywood and be a star, and she turns it down because staying home with family is more important to her than being rich and famous. That is not characteristic of American culture today. To me, American culture is all about, again, this is not a joke and it's not a guess. UCLA researchers looked at the most popular television shows in the United States today compared with 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And the most popular television shows today, shows like iCarly, The Voice, Survivor, it's all about winning and being famous. So over the same time period, there's been an explosion in anxiety and depression among Americans. Now, I'm not saying that there's a simple cause and effect between one and the other, but I don't think they're completely uncorrelated. The fact is, we now live in a culture where people feel like you've got to be an entrepreneur, or we valorize the entrepreneurs. The heroes of current American culture are the entrepreneur who started the tech startup and is now worth $20 billion or $140 billion in the case of Jeff Bezos. And literally, we have schools teaching kids that this is what you should ascribe to. It's no longer about being good. It's not about being humble. And humility. We could talk about humility. As recently as 30 years ago, and indeed for most of American history, humility was regarded as a virtue. Not anymore. So I was talking to parents about the virtue of humility. And a parent said, "That's ridiculous. I don't want to teach my daughter to be humble. I want to teach her to have high self-esteem. So when that big job comes along, she'll go for it. I don't want her to be humble." I said, "Excuse me, I think you're confused. With all due respect, you're confusing being humble with being timid. Those are not the same thing. Indeed, they're nearly opposites. And the virtue you're thinking of that you want for your daughter is not self-esteem. Self-esteem is not a virtue. The virtue you're thinking of is called courage. Courage means that you know your shortcomings and your limitations and your inadequacies. And you find the strength to push forward anyhow. I do regard humility as a virtue, which Jordan Peterson certainly does not.
You're so wrong. You are so wrong about this. Like, courage and humility are a fundamental part of his message. He talks about courage all the time. I think you
I didn't see
sound so
humility
much like
in
Jordan
his
Peterson
book.
here. It's like,
Well, I certainly agree. I am no scholar of Jordan Peterson, and I was so aghast at reading his book and astonished that such outrageous statements. And an outrageous statement is when he says, for example, that in the Christian tradition, Jesus Christ has always been understood to be an androgynous figure, an equal mixture of male and female, which is not a true statement. It's a wildly false statement for which he provides no substantive evidence.
are you a religious man? Because it seems like
I am a Jewish Christian. Yes.
Okay, really? Okay,
I
so
studied the Hebrew Bible, and that presentation to the parents was based on Micah chapter 6, verse 8, when Micah says, "What does the Lord require of you? You got to dot all the I's and cross all the T's?" And Micah says, "No, it's very simple. Here's what the Lord requires. Asut mishpat v'ahavat chesed v'hatznei alechet im Elohecha. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God." So I was talking to the parents, and that's when the mom jumped up and said, "I don't want to teach my daughter to walk humbly. That's ridiculous." Because, again, Americans now are so confused about humility and are immersed in a culture that teaches them that you want to stand proud and shoulders back and assert your place in the dominance hierarchy and launch your startup and sell it for $1 billion. That's what it means to be an American. They are very confused. And the result, because the fact is most of us are not going to launch $1 billion startup. We're not. That's not going to happen. And the result is that 99.9% of us feel like failures because we don't have 1 million followers on Instagram. We don't have $1 billion startup that we launched. We're ordinary people. And that means we're losers in the American culture of Akon, Eminem, 50 Cent, Justin Bieber, Bruno Mars, Miley Cyrus, Childish Gambino. That's not traditional American culture, which valued humility as a virtue, but it is contemporary American culture.
So it sounds like you are advocating for somewhat of a return to traditional family values in some sense, which is you share that with Jordan Peterson.
Well, I'm very careful about the word return because, look, 50 years ago, I mentioned the United States 50 years ago when I mentioned the Andy Griffith Show. 50 years ago, the United States was much more racist and homophobic and sexist than it is today. We don't want to return to that.
Yes, I agree.
But we do need to return to an understanding that winning it all, being a billionaire, being a wildly successful entrepreneur is not and should not be the goal of human life. The goal of human life should be to be a good person, to be kind, to be caring, to be honest, to be a person of character. That's what it's about. And American culture used to try to teach that. Not very well, but it used to try.
Let's move on to the trans issues. This interview is so fascinating to me because while you seem to be very vigorously against the ideas of Jordan Peterson, you seem to be on his side. Like everything you say, most of my audience is Jordan Peterson fans. So I'm curious as hell how they're going to respond to this, because you're making rational, reasonable critiques of Jordan Peterson that I don't think they'll have a problem with. But at the same time, you're voicing an opinion that is very much in sync with Jordan Peterson's message. So
Well, again, I'm the first to concede that I know nothing about Jordan Peterson except from his book 12 Rules for Life. I haven't watched his videos. I haven't read anything else that he's written. And my critique is based entirely on and only on that book. So if he's written other things, I'm at a loss, and I don't pretend to be a scholar of Jordan Peterson.
My takeaway from your book is that the schooling system is being kind of reimagined for females. Like you said in the beginning of this dialogue, that a lot of people, the APA maybe even included, are starting to conceptualize males as broken females. And Jordan Peterson is very much against that. I think you're against that too. Like, what is your take on schooling today? Would you be in favor of like gendered education? Would you be in favor of changing this school system to better accommodate males who many times are just dropping out?
So I wrote a book called Boys Adrift, and the subtitle is The 5 Factors Driving the Growing Epidemic of Unmotivated Boys and Underachieving Young Men. And the new edition of that book, I have a great deal. When I first wrote that book, which is now 12 years ago, the evidence was not as strong. Then the publisher asked me to write an updated edition, which came out a year and a half ago, and the evidence is much stronger now, and it was much easier making the case. Who's graduating with honors? Who's editing the yearbook or the school newspaper? Who's going to university? Who's graduating from university? Who's earning graduate degrees? On all those parameters, there's a growing gender gap, with boys falling farther and farther behind their sisters. Indeed, I have counseled many families where the parents say, our daughter's doing great, she's got straight A's, and our son is a goofball, would rather stay home and play Fortnite, and couldn't care less about failing his Spanish exam. Same family, same resources, same culture. The girl's working hard and the boy's a goofball. That's now well documented. And in my book, Boys Adrift, I present that evidence, and I present my understanding of why it happened. One of the 5 factors, not the only one, not the only factor, maybe not even the most important factor, but one of the 5 factors is changes in education. American education changed over the last 30 years in 4 ways. That one factor has 4 components. But one of those factors that is very easy to explain is that school became unfriendly to boys. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that boys doing things that boys have always done, pointing fingers at each other saying, bang, bang, you're dead, throwing snowballs at each other, writing stories in which people get killed, now can get you in trouble. Boys doing things that boys have always done now gets you in trouble at many American schools. Throwing snowballs. I mean, there's snow outside today. I grew up in northern Ohio outside Cleveland. I attended public schools K through 12. I remember in elementary school during the winter months, we'd put on our jackets during lunch and recess and go outside and throw snowballs at each other, and teachers would come out and join us. I remember Mr. Alberts was a great shot. He'd get you right between the eyes every time. Not anymore. Today, 2 boys throwing snowballs at each other. Teacher runs out and said, "Why are you you're not allowed to do that? You want to throw snowballs? You got to wait till after school. Go somewhere else. You're not allowed to throw snowballs at each other on school property." School has become unfriendly to boys. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is it's so easy to fix. And I have worked with schools, and I give examples of schools that have changed this. And within 1 semester, snowballs, you define an area on campus where the throwing of snowballs is allowed, like the football field. It's off bounds everywhere else, but it's allowed on the football field. Make a snowball tournament. A week from Thursday, whoever wants to can stay after school. We're going to have a tournament. And parry off each pair. You get 3 chances to hit the target with a snowball. Whoever hits it more times advances. Whoever doesn't sits down. At the end of the afternoon, you got 1 grand champion. And the boy who last week said, "School's stupid, I'm going to go home and play Fortnite," now is asking his parents, "Hey, can I stay at school? After school on Thursday, they're having a snowball tournament." You make school friendly to boys without making it unfriendly to girls. Schools I've worked with that have done this, you have a snowball tournament at the elementary school. About 80% of the kids who sign up are boys, but about 20% are girls. Some girls love to throw snowballs. Many boys don't. You can make the school boy friendly without making it unfriendly to girls, and it costs nothing. And if there was any concern, we could fix this problem. The problem is that there is very little concern among the decision makers. The teacher told me how she went to her professor of education at the university where she's earning her master's in education. And she handed my book, Why Gender Matters, to her professor and said, "I'd like to lend you this book. I think you'd really find it interesting." And she told me her professor of education looked at the cover, and the title says, Why Gender Matters, What Parents and Teachers Need to Know About the Emerging Science of Sex Differences. The professor did not touch the book, seemed to regard it as an unclean thing. And the professor said, "I have no interest in reading such sexist rubbish," and wouldn't even touch it. Backed away, the teacher told me, from this unclean thing. So unfortunately, there is very little interest in addressing this problem of boys adrift. On the contrary, enlightened professors of education at leading universities in the United States now regard even the very terms boy and girl as retrograde. Enlightened people don't use such words. And indeed, I debated one of these enlightened professors, Rebecca Bigler, University of Texas, Austin, who said that teachers should not use the terms boys and girls because, in her words, that reinforces the Aristotelian binary of the heteronormative patriarchy. Enlightened people use terms like students or citizens, Professor Bigler said. And incidentally, she's very consistent. If you go to Professor Bigler's website, you'll find that she no longer refers to herself as she. She now prefers the terms G, I believe, Z-H-E, Z-I-R. She's not trans or lesbian. She just is trying to deconstruct the Aristotelian binary because she firmly believes that male and female are social constructs that are harmful. When you try to talk to such a person about strategies to engage boys in education, they're like, "Oh my gosh, we have no interest in such sexist rubbish."
Is this a problem in our university systems? Is that where you think this ideology is originating?
It is a problem at the leading universities, certainly at Harvard Graduate School of Education, Columbia Barnard Teachers College, University of Texas, Austin, University of Wisconsin, Madison. I have debated people from all those institutions, and they all insist that male and female are social constructs and that enlightened people don't even use terms like boys and girls because it reinforces the Aristotelian binary. So yeah, I think we've got a big problem. But I don't think we will solve that problem with Jordan Peterson coming along and talking about male and female order and chaos. We need people who understand that gender is complicated, but the binaries do not align. Yes, there is order and there is chaos. Yes, there is male and there is female, but those binaries have nothing to do with one another.
So the reason why Jordan Peterson is so popular is because he is challenging these ideas that are coming out of the university about there being no difference, there being no biological sex differences. I mean, you highlight so many of them in your book and cite research study after research study. I don't understand how these people can deny this.
Good question. Let me address that first. So when you confront these people and you say to Professor Becky Bigler, "Well, what do you think about Jillian Alexander's findings that the male and female visual system are hardwired quite differently? That the male visual system has more resources devoted to speed and direction. The female visual system has more resources devoted to color and detail. And this is true not only in humans, Jillian Alexander finds, but in monkeys and chimpanzees as well." How does Dr. Bigler respond Does she have a rebuttal? She doesn't. They've never heard of this research. They are completely unaware of the research I cite on hardwired sex differences in hearing, in vision, in brain development. They don't know about it, and they don't want to know about it. They have no curiosity. They are pushing a particular ideology now with respect and deference to Professor Bigler. I understand where she's coming from. And this is another reason why I'm so concerned about Dr. Peterson. Why does Dr. Bigler believe as she does? Why does Judith Butler believe as she does? Why does Anne Fausto Sterling at Brown believe as she does? Because we have more than 2,000 years of Western history of men saying that men and women are fundamentally different, and using that argument of essential difference as grounds for excluding women from the marketplace, from equal rights. I get it. That's why they're upset, and that's why they're very suspicious of any talk of innate difference, because they're well aware that Aristotle to Elvis Presley have used arguments of innate difference between male and female as grounds for keeping women out and keeping women down. And this is why I think Jordan Peterson ultimately is immensely harmful and doesn't know it. Because by equating male with order and female with chaos, he is reinforcing the understandably deep-seated concerns that many in the academy have about essential difference. He's making the job harder, not easier.
So it's a question of style, you feel, more than...
Well, no, I think it's a question of substance. I think that Jordan Peterson shows very little awareness of the complexity and nuance of gender and the importance of insisting on equal rights for women and of acknowledging the awful legacy of 2,000 years of prejudice and injustice toward women. And, after I read 12 Rules for Life and was so disappointed, I went back and read again David Brooks and Peggy Newton, who had inspired me to read his book in the first place. And when I read them again, I realized that I had kind of misunderstood. I'd read their articles originally as an endorsement of the book because they were published when the book came out and mentioned the book, but they're not. When you go back and read what David Brooks and Peggy Noonan actually wrote and read between the lines, you realize that what they're really excited about is not the book at all, but the way Jordan Peterson handles his detractors in live interviews. That's what they love, because he's up against these left-of-center people who are throwing this stuff at him, and he zings it right back. He's got these great responses, and you got to admire that, because, I've done those interviews, and 3 days later I'll think of, I know what I should have said, but my brain doesn't work that fast. I come up with the great response long after the cameras are off. Jordan Peterson's great gift is his gift for repartee, that he can think of the right thing to say while the interview's happening. And I think that's a big factor driving his enormous popularity, is these videos, most of which I have not watched. And there's this Canadian interview where they've got like 5 left-of-center people against him, 5 against 1. And he just demolishes them. And one of the comments was like, 5 against 1 is totally not fair. It should have been 100 against 1, because he just made him look silly.
People do love him in interviews, and he definitely is giving them responses. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people intuitively relate to the responses that he's giving. And the people that are responding to him are responding with stuff that they've learned in like their gender studies class or something. So it's so alien to these people, it just makes absolutely no sense. They don't have any kind of connection with him. We should talk a bit about the the trans issues as well, because you mentioned trans stuff in your book, Why Gender Matters. You also talk about a study where they do MRI tests on people and see somewhat of a different brain pattern in males and females. You also cite.
Looks like you got the first edition.
Am I? Yeah. See, you have an updated edition. That's why I was going to say the edition that I have is relatively old. So,
oh my gosh, you got to throw it out.
Okay. So get us up to speed then.
Yeah. In the first edition of Why Gender Matters, I had one page on transgender where I cited an even older article from the 1990s that seemed to show that in one area, the stria terminalis, at the base of the brain in men who said they were women, that one area looks something like it does in women. That article has been cited hundreds of times. It has never been replicated. It's more than 20 years old now, and no subsequent research has found anything like it. So, as I said, in the first edition of Why Gender Matters, I had one page on transgender. In the new edition, Penguin Random House asked me to write a new edition, and I spent a year working on that. And the new edition has 12 chapters. 4 of the 12 chapters are on gender nonconforming, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So I now have more than one full chapter now on transgender. In the United Kingdom, they keep numbers. They have a national health insurance. We don't have anything analogous to that in this country, following everyone in the whole country. In all of the United Kingdom, in 2010, there were 40 girls who said they were transgender. Last year, there were 1,800 girls in the UK who said they were transgender. So that's an increase of 4,000% in less than 10 years. And the numbers we have from this country show something very similar is happening here as well. There's great confusion about what it means to be male and what it means to be female. And what's really weird in the research is that sexual orientation appears to be more fixed than sexual identity. In other words, who you want to sleep with is harder to change than who you go to bed as. So this man, Bruce Jenner, earns an Olympic gold medal in decathlon, and then in his 60s says, oh, you know what? I'm actually a woman, and my name is now Caitlin. Okay, great. He's now a woman, but his sexual orientation has not changed. He still wants to be intimate only with women. So he goes from being male to being female, but who he wants to be intimate with does not change. That's kind of a surprise. I think before we had this research, most of us might have imagined, perhaps, I don't know what other people's intuitions are, but I certainly might have guessed that your identity as male as or female might be somewhat more fixed than your orientation of who you go to bed with. The evidence strongly suggests that the opposite is true, that your identity is very fragile and can change, but your orientation is much more biologically determined. And I present that evidence in the 4 chapters of the now conclude the revised edition.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the places that I wanted to bring up, because, and it might be someplace where I actually disagree with Jordan Peterson, so I'm curious your feedback on this, and it does have to do with the brain. You cite, I'm gonna murder this. It's ganglomorphs. It's bilateral ganglomorphs. Am I getting that right? They're the birds that are half male and half female.
No, it's not. There's no plural there.
Okay.
I describe a particular bird is what's called a lateral gynaendomorph, meaning it is a chimera. Every cell on one side of its body is chromosomally male. Every cell on the other side of its body is chromosomally female. Such anomalies occur in our species with a frequency of about 1 in 2 million. An XXXY chimera, an individual who is both an ovary and a testicle, who is a fusion of 2 individuals in one. This is a true intersex individual. And again, I devote a big chunk of the new edition of Why Gender Matters to a better understanding of intersex. Intersex is rare. About 2 in 10,000 live births in the United States are intersex individuals. So that's about 0.02%. but it happens, and there are many thousands such individuals in the United States, and they are both male and female. So that is, and again, I devote a significant chunk of chapter 11 to understanding and explaining such individuals.
So as you know, Jordan Peterson has this theory about how the brain is bifurcated, and one side he believes is focused on order and the other side is focused on chaos. And in your book, you talk about these bilateral gynandromorphs. See, I told you I was going to murder. They have, this is some of the research that shows that men and women have very different brains as far as bifurcation.
No, I have to argue with you there. First of all, this notion of the hemispheres was a very popular notion 30 years ago. It is not so big in neuroscience today, and it is an area where, again, sex interacts with hemispheric specialization. Again, 30 years ago, there's a notion that the left hemisphere is logical and right hemisphere is emotional. The reality is more complex than that. But let's talk specifically about how sex and hemispheric specialization intersect. All that earlier research, incidentally, had been done almost exclusively on men prior to 1985. And in men, it may be somewhat true. In women, it's not at all true. Women use both hemispheres for many processes where men are more unilateral. So, for example, when an older man has a stroke, if it affects his left hemisphere, he's very likely, if he's right-handed, he's very likely going to be impaired in language. If it impairs his right hemisphere, he won't be impaired in language. A woman who is right-handed and has a stroke affecting the same area in the left hemisphere is much less likely to have a serious language deficit and will recover much faster, because in women, language is much more bilateral. So the notion that the left language was linguistic and the right hemisphere was spatial may be of some validity for men, turns out to have much less validity for women. So the whole notion of hemispheric specialization applies to women much less than it does to men.
Yeah, that is the one place where I see Jordan Peterson's argument kind of breaking down against the scientific research, because if our brains are that different between sexes, then he's really coming up with an idea, this idea that one side focuses on order and one side focuses on chaos, just in males. It doesn't actually translate to all of the human species.
Yeah, it certainly does not. He's not knowledgeable about neuroscience, and when he speaks about it, you can tell that he went to school on the order of 30 years ago and hasn't read much since then.
Do you know anything? Because he's done some talks with another researcher that has evidently looked into this, but I don't know if his research is old and maybe he's only done research on males and not females. I know this is a problem in research. A lot of the older research is only done on males because then they avoid the menstruation problem. So
again, brain imaging prior to 1990, you were talking about PET scans, positron emission transaxial tomograms, which is radiations. It's ionizing radiation, so it would be very dangerous to a woman who's pregnant. I'm going to have to leave shortly. I'm kind of out of time here, but
that's okay. Can we? Let's finish our thought here, and then can I ask you just one question on the trans issue? Like, a lot of people are going through this trans stuff, and I feel like if my listeners are feeling that gender dysphoria, what would be some of your advice on dealing with that? Or if you're a parent that has a child that is claiming to have gender dysphoria, I know it's such a touchy topic in this day and age, but you are a medical doctor and a psychologist,
Sure.
so I'm curious your take on that.
And I have advised such parents. So let's say your 5-year-old son comes to you and says he is a girl. What do we know about such individuals? We actually know quite a bit. And again, the new edition of Why Gender Matters, I present this research. We have people like Kenneth Zucker who spent the last 40 years following such individuals, and he's got 40 years of data on what happens to these kids. What's this boy doing 20 years down the road? 15, 20 years down the road, the great majority of these boys, certainly more than 80%, will not say that they are female. The majority of these boys will grow up to be gay men. He's a man. He doesn't want to be a woman. He certainly doesn't want anyone to cut off his penis or give him female hormones. He is a gay man, and he's very happy being a gay man. A small minority of these boys will persist. 15 years down the road, they still say, I am a woman. Well, then how are we going to tell? Oh, and I should also mention that a significant fraction of these boys grow up to be straight men who just happen to like ballet and glitter. And incidentally, I'm a straight man who likes ballet and glitter. So I'm very keen on this topic. So what is best practice if you are a parent and your 5-year-old son says that he's a girl? Not, I want to be a girl. He says, I am a girl. Well, you want to figure out his sexual orientation. Is he straight or gay? Well, how do you do that? It's not easy. I remember when I was 7 years old, I asked my mom. I vividly remember. I remember exactly where I was in our home when I asked her, Mom, if I marry a girl, do I have to take off my PJs in bed with her? And my mom said, yes, you will, but you'll want to. I said, no, I won't. Girls have cooties. It is not meaningful to ask a 7-year-old or a 5-year-old about their preferred sexual partner. They don't have a sexual orientation, nor should they. They are prepubescent children, and prepubescent children don't want to engage in sexual intimacy and can't tell you anything about it. So you cannot, there is, as a matter of fact, there is no accurate way to determine what is the sexual orientation of this 5-year-old boy. Given that fact, and it is a fact, you don't know what road he's going to go. As Kenneth Zucker has said many times, we don't know where this boy's road will end. Let's help him on the journey, but we don't know where the road is going. So he wants to study ballet, that's great. But he will study ballet as a boy, not as a girl. He doesn't have to play football. He doesn't have to roll in the mud and wrestle. He can play ballet. He can draw a picture of a flower. That's great. We're going to celebrate who he is. And again, in my book, Why Gender Matters, I show that a great deal of that, much more than anyone guessed, is hardwired. But don't put him in a dress and change his name to Emily at 5 years of age. That's not in his best interest. Because if he turns out to be a gay man, you're not helping him. You're confusing him. Let kids find their own way. Don't push them into your preconceived notions of who they should be. That, I submit, is best practice. And I defend that in my book, Why Gender Matters.
Well, that's very...
The new edition.
When is the audiobook out for that?
Oh, it's out. It's been out.
Oh, really? I'm gonna have to pick it up. So that is very practical advice, which I thank you for. Do you have any social media or any upcoming events? You had mentioned that you did debates with people. Are those online, or can we watch those?
If you go to my website, leonardsax.com, you can see where I'm going to be speaking. You can also click on television interviews, and you can watch the ones that I think are worthwhile. The others I haven't linked to.
So, but they're out there. These debates are out there. Yeah, that's great. I would love. I think it would be so beneficial for you to have a dialogue with Jordan Peterson. I know that you have differences with him, but you're obviously a very, very intelligent man. He is a very, very intelligent man. And there's so much overlap in the stuff that you're talking about. I just think it would be fascinating and people would enjoy it. So if he reaches out to me, I will definitely forward any information to you. So
yeah, fat chance.
Well, you don't suffer from the optimism bias, do you?
No. Yeah, well, he's a busy guy. I mean, he is in huge demand worldwide, and I think he has better things to do than to respond to a family doctor in Malvern who's only read one of his books.
Well, I do thank you, and I think my viewers will find this very interesting. So we'll leave it there. I know you have something else coming up.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time and for the information.
Great. Thanks again.
So I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Leonard Sax. As I said before, if Jordan Peterson is interested in contacting Dr. Sax, I think it would be a fascinating discussion these two very intelligent men could have. I'm curious, as always, your thoughts on this discussion, and you can leave those in the comments below. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. I'm Adam. I hope you learned something new today, and we will see you in the next video.
Well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering. Because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering.